Good afternoon. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims. I'm the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are so pleased to welcome former U.S. Representative John Delaney to campus today for a conversation with Dr. Ruth Block Rubin. I want to remind you that the University of Chicago is a tax-exempt 501c3 organization and does not support any political candidate for office. I also want to mention a few upcoming events. Next Wednesday, we have Caroline Kennedy, the former U.S. Ambassador to Japan, for a wide-ranging conversation about her career in public service and the challenges that the U.S. currently faces abroad. Should know these by heart. We have this and other events that are listed on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We will have questions after the conversation. Please raise your hand and Dr. Block Rubin will call on you. We have restrooms down the hall for those who need it. I'd like to remind those of you who have phones to please turn them on silent. And here to introduce, oh, sorry, we've got questions too. I think we're gonna do, this is gonna be our handheld mic, so just raise your hand and we'll get you the mic as well. The first three questions, please, should come from students. We remind you that a question ends in a question mark. And here to introduce our speaker is Reina Vishwanath. Reina is a third-year student from Mumbai studying political science and economics. This year, she is the communications intern here at the IOP and has been involved in our Women in Public Service program. Please join me in welcoming her to the microphone.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are honored to have former Congressman John Delaney at the IOP today to discuss his vision for the country's future. Mr. Delaney's storied career, both in politics and in business, give him unique insight into the intersection of these two areas. Having founded two companies prior to his election as a representative for Maryland's 6th District, Mr. Delaney has formidable entrepreneurial experience. His first company, Healthcare Financial Partners, made him the youngest CEO on the New York Stock Exchange. In fact, while serving in the House of Representatives, Mr. Delaney held the unique distinction of being the only former CEO of a publicly traded company in office. While in Congress, Mr. Delaney played crucial roles on the Committee on Financial Services and the National Economic Committee. He also authored legislation to create a carbon tax, ensure equal access to pre-K education, and protect veterans' credit scores, among many other initiatives. And now, Mr. Delaney is running for the highest office in the land, President of the United States. Our conversation today will delve into Mr. Delaney's vision for the future of both the country and the Democratic Party. Mr. Delaney is joined by Assistant Professor Ruth Block Rubin from the Political Science Department here at UChicago. Professor Block Rubin studies American legislative institutions, patterns of lawmaking, and intra-party organizations. She was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in Health Policy Research at Harvard University, and her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation as well as the Social Science Research Council. So, without further ado, I present to you Professor Block Rubin and former Congressman John Delaney.
All right. Thanks, Reina. Congressman, I want to begin with a general question about your time in Congress.
Sure.
And I think this is probably on many people's minds with our current politics, which is that bipartisan legislation and working across the party aisle seems increasingly difficult. Do you think this is just a matter of the parties being farther away ideologically, more so than they used to be, or are there other contributing factors you think are important?
So first of all, Professor, thank you for having me. And I want to thank the University of Chicago for allowing me to appear before you today. So the question is about Congress, and I love my time in Congress. I served 6 years. But there are obviously many forces going on in this country that is driving the polarization, not only in the country in general, but the Congress in particular. And I think the Congress in particular is even more polarized than the country, which at this point is very polarized. So gerrymandering plays a huge kind of role in this. I think only like 15% of the seats in the House of Representatives are considered competitive at this point. And if you believe that incentives matter, which I do, people in competitive districts have an incentive to not only represent the people in their party, but people who are independents and in the other party, because they in fact could lose a general election and they need those voters to support them. But if you're in a one-sided district, either one-sided Democrat or Republican, I hate to say this because members shouldn't behave this way, but they definitely have an incentive to only focus on their party's voters, because those voters really are the ones that determine whether they're successful or not through primaries. So that's a huge factor. And then you combine that with the money that exists now in politics, particularly because of Citizens United, which in my judgment was a terrible court ruling and has clearly put way too much money in politics, and dark money in politics, because no one knows who donates to these things. The combination of gerrymandering, money in politics, the fact that we've had a hard time as a country adjusting to changes in our media, right? There are so many ways people get information, and some of those sources are not really formal sources of journalism, social media, et cetera. I'll try to put it kindly. That the country's struggling with this, and the Congress in particular. So it's really, it has gotten very hard. And if you look at how Congress has performed, you go back to like the 90th Congress and fast forward to now the 116th, and you kind of map out how often the people work together, it's stunning how polarized the Congress has actually become. So it's a lot of forces, I think, converging at once that have resulted in this.
Interesting. So to think a little bit about partisan gerrymandering,
Yes.
since I know this is an issue that you spent some time thinking about in Congress, do you think, or why do you think that putting control of drawing districts in the hands of independent commissions is a good idea? And are there any drawbacks to the sort of top two primary strategy?
So I support a top two primary strategy, and I support independent commissions. And to some extent, you need one or the other. You don't necessarily need both. Right? If we thought these districts were drawn kind of on the level, and more of them as a result would be competitive, you don't need some of the other reforms like top two primaries and things like that. So I'm not saying that an independent commission's drawing districts would be perfect. It certainly wouldn't be. But I think in general, it would lead to a more on the level outcome.
Interesting. And do you think that California experience makes you feel more confident in that, or less?
It makes me feel more confident, because if you look at the state legislature in particular in California, and as you know, California had independent commissions, or because of a referendum, we have California has independent commissions and top two primaries. If you look at the state legislature in particular, I think you see a clear moderation in the legislature, which doesn't mean it's directly changed California as a progressive state and trying to achieve progressive goals, but there's definitely been a focus in the legislature on getting more things done. Because if you're in a competitive district, whether it's a state legislative district or a House seat in the U.S. Congress, what allows you to win a competitive district is actually running on solving problems, right? Running on getting things done and then getting those things done. So you just become wired towards trying to find common ground and getting things done. And I just think that's a very positive force in American politics, because that's really been the problem with our politics, is we've stopped doing things. And the world has changed so rapidly in the last several decades because of technology and globalization, and we've needed a government to respond to these changes and do things for our citizens. And the polarization in many ways has made political speeches and party platforms more important than actual progress in the legislature.
So on the subject of doing things,
Yes.
it seems that junior members of the Democratic caucus are more publicly prominent and are playing a larger role in the caucus today than has been true historically. Why? Do you think this is overall a good thing? Or are there costs that we as casual observers of politics might not necessarily think about?
Well, I think it's a good thing, which doesn't mean seniority isn't relevant. It certainly is, and you do have to learn the job. But I think the rules had been stacked, particularly in the Democratic caucus, to make it very difficult for more junior members to have a voice in the caucus. And Speaker Pelosi has actually led the charge to change some of these rules. She's given junior members more representation on the key kind of strategic decisions in the caucus, something called the Steering and Policy Committee. She's created a leadership position that can only be held by people who have had, I think it's 4 terms or less. So I think she's done a nice job responding to a lot of the pushback that Democrats have had. And in part, the Republicans have actually done this a little better, because they don't have a pure seniority system, and they've put term limits on their committee chairs. And while I understand why we have a seniority system, and I understand the reasons why people push back on term limits, you do see a lot more kind of turnover in the Republican side among key committee people. And I remember once then Speaker Ryan made an observation that he came into the Congress the same time as Joe Crowley did. they were in the same class together, and he had already been chairman of 2 committees, and Joe Crowley was, 20 years away from being a chair on the Ways and Means Committee.
Interesting. So are there other things that the Democratic caucus can learn from the way the Republican conference does business?
No, I do believe that having some limit on how long people can be chair or ranking member is a healthy reform. I don't think it should be too short. I tend to think the Republicans actually have made it a little too short, but I think that's a healthy change that I think most people view as constructive.
Interesting. So as you mentioned, in her bid to win the speakership, Nancy Pelosi agreed to establish a select committee to study a range of proposals for new rules and procedures. So as someone who served in the House for a while, are there particular rules reforms that you think the committee should consider? And for voters, to what extent should we care about these kinds of parliamentary reforms?
I mean, it is a little bit of inside baseball.
That's what I was gonna
And I know you do a lot of scholarly work on Congress, so I'm sure. But first of all, the chair of that committee, Derek Kilmer, is a very good friend of mine, and he's terrific, so I think he's going to do a really good job. There are some ideas that are good. For example, committee chairs historically has been selected by the whole caucus. And a lot of people think, for example, the chairs of the committee should be selected by the committee itself. So there's an example, right, where in a leadership structure where, because of money in politics, the speaker and the other senior positions have a lot of power because they control a lot of the money that goes out to members, unfortunately. You get a situation where those people also have a lot of say as to who are the chairs of the committees, right, because they are always helping out a bunch of members. Where if you're on the Energy and Commerce Committee, I could make a very good argument why the Democratic either ranking member or chair of that committee should be chosen by the Democrats on that committee, because they have served with the people. They know whose kind of ideas as chair or ranking member they think best represents what the direction of the caucus could be. So some things like that, which sound kind of simple. I don't think most Americans actually care that much about that stuff, but I think there's some good stuff to do there.
Interesting. So to talk a little bit more about members at different stages of their career. So we talked about junior members. On the flip side, it seems like congressional tenures are getting shorter and shorter.
Yeah.
Why do you think folks are leaving Congress rather than trying to climb the seniority ladder?
Well, I think, again, there's a question that people have about how, kind of, unless you empower junior members, some of them sit there and say, well, it's going to take me so long to actually get in a position where I have any authority, I might as well go run for governor, or I might as well run for the Senate, or I might as well run for county executive, or run for mayor, or something like that. So I think, that's one of the problems with making, creating a situation where people have to delay gratification to have any say on policy for so long. When other opportunities pop up, they pursue them, and I think there's been a lot of that.
Interesting. So in looking at your legislative record, you've been a strong advocate for bipartisan legislation and solutions to our national problems. Are there issues where you think the parties can still reach agreement and consensus that we're ignoring in sort of the more appealing, vicious debates that?
Absolutely. Well, so I just introduced a bipartisan carbon tax bill, which was myself and 2 Democratic colleagues, so there were 3 Democrats, and then 3 Republicans joined us. And it was it's a very big piece of legislation. It puts a price on carbon, it collects all the money, it dividends it back to the American people. And I think climate change is a huge issue, and we have to be dealing with it now, and we need action now. So there's an example. Climate change, which is viewed as a polarizing issue, there's a bipartisan pathway. Infrastructure, which is something that has historically been supported by Democrats and Republicans. I've led a huge bipartisan initiative, as have other people. Even the Affordable Care Act, which has obviously been very polarizing, Senators Alexander and Murray have a very good bipartisan proposal in the Senate to actually improve the Affordable Care Act. Criminal justice reform, we just saw, I think we need to do more, but we just saw the First Step Act, which was a good first step. It's something we can do. Comprehensive immigration reform, in 2013, there was a huge bipartisan deal. And it was one of the great tragedies of my experience in the Congress that never got passed. So I actually think, and one of the things I talk about as part of my new run for president, is I think it would be amazing if a president in their first 100 days, and this is what I would do, only advanced existing bipartisan proposals that are in the Congress. Because as you probably know, there's a lot of great ideas. We were talking upstairs about digital privacy, right? That's an area Democrats and Republicans care about, and they should care about. So whether it's digital privacy, infrastructure, immigration reform, improving the Affordable Care Act, potentially a carbon tax, I think it would be great if we actually spent more of our time focusing on some of these areas where we have common ground. because there's a lot of good-minded Democrats and Republicans who have really worked hard to try to put together some bipartisan proposals.
So how can we as voters distinguish among candidates who are often drawing distinctions between the parties to identify issues where there is agreement and where members and future presidents are able to collaborate?
So I think the way people should be, I think we need to change how we evaluate candidates, right? We have to evaluate candidates both on what they stand for and what their vision for the future is, you know, and why they're pursuing public service in terms of accomplishing these goals. It's almost like one axis should be that, and the other axis should be, okay, what is your track record for actually finding common ground to get these things done? And if we actually thought of that, thought of it in those terms, which is I'm going to weigh both what you stand for and what you're trying to do, and I'm also going to consider how, you know, there's lots of services that track this stuff, but I want to hear from you. Give me examples of where you've worked to get things done, because the time for speeches is over, the time for action is now. And I just think if the American people oriented themselves towards demanding results from their elected officials and not just passionate speeches, I think it would generally improve, you know, politics and policy in this country.
So you think American voters are interested in rewarding bipartisanship still?
I absolutely. When you talk to most Americans and say, how do you feel about people working together to solve problems? They're like, oh, I'm all for that. And so I think what we need to do is say, okay, well, let's actually start asking our candidates, like, okay, what is your plan to do these things? I understand you think climate change is a huge issue, and we can all talk about the existential threat it is, but show me how you're going to get some progress done on it. And I think that's going to be the next wave of politics, because I think the American people are getting fed up with all this inaction and all this fighting, and they're going to start demanding some results.
So it's interesting that you say that. So many other presidential hopefuls, of which there are many, are embracing fairly liberal policies for the Democratic Party, ones that might have been viewed as fringe not too long ago. So the sort of flip side to the question I just asked you is, do you think that voters are tired of middle-of-the-road policies, the sort of third way of a previous era, or is there something else going on to suggest why these candidates are, and you know, when they run for the House and the Senate, are gaining traction?
I think the American people understand there's a real structural unfairness in our society right now. There's a structural unfairness in our tax code. There's a structural unfairness in our immigration policy, in our criminal justice system. You know, the main institutions of society, in many ways, at this moment in time, are not serving either the moral aspirations of our country or creating the kind of equal society where everyone has the same opportunity regardless of the conditions of your birth, type of society that we all strive for. So I think the American people are rightly fed up with the structural unfairness. And so people are excited about big new ideas to try to break that. And I just think what we have to do is both get excited about some of these ideas, but also try to make sure we're talking about the roadmap for making it happen. Right? Because we need to aspire and make progress. Aspire and make progress. Aspirations without any progress, you know, is just kind of a wish in some ways.
Sure, that makes sense. So as a presidential candidate, what do you think are the best ways for Democrats to ensure an open nominating process where we can vet all of the various people who are making their pitches to the American people, while at the same time avoid exposing internal differences that one could imagine Republicans could easily exploit?
So I think we always have to remember this is a battle of ideas. And we want to make it kind of a meritocracy of ideas, where the best ideas win. And the only way to have a real battle of ideas is for people to give everyone a fair hearing. If too many voters jump to judgment too quickly without seeing the debate of ideas, I think that doesn't serve us well. So what I encourage people to do is I say, this is going to be a big field. You shouldn't make up your mind too soon, right? You should listen to the debates. You should have an open mind. And you should insist on your party running a process that's on the level. And I think the DNC actually just came forward with a good first step in that regard in terms of what they did with the debates. I mean, the Republicans last time had a really big field. And people think the Democrats are going to have a big field. And what the Republicans did is they said, okay, we're going to take this big field and we're going to sort it out by polling. And we're going to create the first stage, and then we're going to kind of create the kiddie stage based on how you polled. And some people were more well-known. Others were not as well-known. You know, Lindsey Graham, who's been a very senior member of the Senate, wasn't well known. He got on the kiddie stage. And the American people largely didn't pay attention to that. And so some people's campaign was over before it started. So I think we've learned from that. And what the Democratic Party is going to do is they're going to somehow figure out how to qualify the candidates. You know, are you running real campaigns? Do you have teams? Are you doing the kind of stuff you're supposed to do? And once they do that, then they're going to randomly sort them. So it's going to be like pulling names out of a hat. And there's going to be 2 stages because of the side of the field, but it's going to be on different nights, and they're going to be randomly sorted. And that'll be for the first 3 debates. And but there's an example of there's a party that is actually interested in making sure we have kind of an on-the-level debate. I think elected officials shouldn't be endorsing people before their voters get a chance to vote. As a former superdelegate, I don't object to superdelegates, but I think they need to be circuit breakers, not kingmakers. And in the past, some of these candidates have basically focused on trying to get the superdelegates support. They're not even worried about campaigning with people because they say, well, if I get the superdelegates, I'll roll out all their endorsements. That'll influence the mind of the voters. But that's not the way it's supposed to work, right? The voters are supposed to hear from the candidates, and the voters are supposed to. So I think we got to do that kind of stuff.
That makes a lot of sense. So elected members of the Democratic Party and the coalition itself are increasingly diverse. So to what extent do you think it's important for voters to prioritize what we might think of as descriptive representation over substantive representation?
So I think, listen, I think diversity is an enormous strength of this country, and we should be celebrating it and encouraging it and thinking about how we build our society so that everyone is represented at the table, because only through fair representations of men and women and people of different race and sexual orientation around the table do you get the best outcomes for society broadly. In terms of how people make their individual voting decisions, I kind of view that up to them, right? So I don't think you can be prescriptive about it, but I think we should all be acknowledging that what a great strength diversity is to our country, and unless we actually have leaders that represent the country in general, we're never going to get the true country we deserve.
That seems very fair. So I'm going to ask you 2 final questions that are
Okay.
policy-oriented, that are sort of things that probably everyone here is wondering, and I figured it would be best to just ask it.
Sure.
So many freshman Democrats are pushing Speaker Pelosi to consider impeaching the president. What are the relative advantages and risks to Congress's reputation and the Democratic Party if the House were to consider articles of impeachment?
So I'll tell you how I've thought about impeachment. Impeachment is a tool that obviously our founders gave us to deal with a president that was unlawful, broadly defined without any clear definition, in a way that a significant majority of the American people want them removed from office. So one of the reasons I have not been supportive of the House moving forward with impeachment against the president, who I believe has done unlawful acts. In fact, I was a plaintiff suing him for his hotel in Washington under the Emoluments Clause, which to me, the president is clearly violating. He is taking payments from foreign governments through the operation of his hotel, and that is prohibited under the Emoluments Clause. So I believe he is doing unlawful acts. But I also have realized up to this point that 2/3 of the American people do not support him being removed from office. And as you know, impeachment is done with a majority in the House, and it takes 2/3 of the Senate to convict. So I don't think it's productive to the common good of the country to move forward with this political process of impeachment, because it is a political process. It is designed as a political way of removing a president, because there's no definition of it. I don't think it's helpful to trying to unify our country and maintain the sense of common purpose if we try to impeach a president that a majority of a significant majority of the country doesn't believe should be removed from office. And I think there are 2 examples in modern times of this. There's President Nixon and there's President Clinton. The overwhelming majority of the American people wanted President Nixon removed from office. They didn't even have to start the impeachment process, and he resigned because he knew what was going to happen. President Clinton was impeached, and it was about a 50-50 split. In fact, I think towards the end, less than half of the American people wanted him impeached. And so public sentiment is everything on this issue. And I don't think it serves the interest of the citizens of this country to begin impeachment process unless the public sentiment is overwhelming behind you, for you, because that's really why it was created. Now, elected officials, part of their job is to convince the American people of what's going on and change public sentiment. But that's kind of how I think about it.
I see. Okay, so
The second question?
final question, it's about the government shutdown.
Sure.
So we are currently experiencing the longest government shutdown in American history,
Yes.
as far as I understand. And so the question, as someone who's spent time in Congress,
Right.
is there a way out? And is there a bipartisan solution?
Yes.
What do we do as voters, as people who have family members who are federal workers?
And in my district, my former district, I represented over 100,000 current or former federal workers. I think it was the third largest concentration. So this is an issue that's hit really close to home for me. I think it's terrible what happened. And what I really think should happen is the Senate should reopen the government. Because if enough members of the House and the Senate reopen the government, it doesn't matter what the president does. Because he could veto reopening and he can override the veto. Putting that aside for a second, because I think your question is deeper than that. I happen to be one of those people who believe there is potentially a big and positive thing to do around opening up the government in light of this place we're at. So an issue that really I've cared a lot about since I've been in Congress is the condition of dreamers in this country. And as you know, dreamers were protected with this DACA legislation, which was always designed to be a temporary fix because we couldn't do comprehensive immigration reform. And I think if we could work out an arrangement so that the dreamers were not protected with DACA, which is a short-term fix, but were actually given permanent legal status in this country with a pathway to citizenship, so that the 1.8 million human beings who go to bed every night probably at some level worrying about being deported, and the thought of that in terms of what they're dealing with. If we could create a situation where they have permanent legal status and a pathway to citizenship, because these people didn't do anything wrong. They came to this country as kids. They've been following the laws of the country. They're incredibly important members of our society. If we could do that, would I agree to some money for border security, including if some of that went to build this steel slat wall, which I don't think is the most efficient use of money? But if I could protect these 1.8 million people, I would agree to that deal.
And so do you think that the Democrats are right to say we're not going to talk about any of this border security until government is opened, or is that a mistake?
I think it's fine to talk about that, and maybe something really attractive will get put on the table, and then maybe you change your mind. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that's how, like for example, if the comprehensive immigration reform bill that should have passed in 2013, if we could pass that tomorrow, which our immigration system, listen, my wife and I went to the border 3 weeks ago. We took 14 law students with us and 2 law professors to help process asylum cases at the border. We went to a detention facility where there were 1,700 women and children who were seeking asylum in this country. So I sat there and heard these stories. I mean, and I think we should be more welcoming to people seeking asylum in this country. I mean, we really need to reform our immigration system. So as an extreme example, if we could suddenly make that 2013 bill law, and if in part of that, as part of border security, because that comprehensive deal had tons of money for border security, if some of it were to build that steel slat fence or whatever you want to call it, yeah, I'd be fine with that.
Sounds great. All right, thank you. So I think we are going to turn
Good questions.
to student questions, hopefully.
Hi, my name is Johnny. I'm a fourth year in college. Thanks for being here today. If elected president, would you seek to reverse any hypothetical progress that Trump has made on this wall?
Any hypothetical progress that Trump has made?
On this wall.
Well, listen, the way I think about border security is, I want to secure our border, and I want to do it in the most effective way. I want to do it in the most cost-effective way, and I want to do it in a way that, best represents our country. So if I was, when I'm elected president, because that's how I think about it, I'm sure border security is going to be an ongoing thing. And, I favor technology solutions at the border. In some ways, what we should kind of be building is a wall of drones, not a physical wall, because it's a more cost-effective and more effective way of securing our border, and I've done a lot of work on this. So I would immediately pivot to what I think we should do, and then make decisions about what's there, and whatever's there probably ends up staying there, and then you kind of plug in the gaps is how I would do it.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you for being here. You submitted your bid for the candidacy pretty early on.
Right.
And I was just wondering, what was your thought process behind that? What advantage do you see in declaring your intent to run for president so early?
Well, I thought I might clear the field, but I guess that hasn't happened. I think I'm the right person for the job, and I have the right vision for the country. I think this country is terribly divided, needs to be unified. We need to restore a sense of common purpose. We need to start working together to get real things done, and we need to restore a sense of moral aspiration for who we are as a people and the kind of future we want to build. And that's why I'm running for president. So I think that's the right vision, and I think I'm the right person, but not enough people knew who I was, and still don't know who I am enough. They do in Iowa and New Hampshire, where I've done 32 visits to those two states in the last year and done over 300 events, but they don't broadly. So the way I solved that problem is by getting in early and working harder. And that was the path for me. You know, some other people, Vice President Biden, for example, he doesn't have to get in early. Everyone knows who Joe Biden is, and they have well-formulated opinions of him. And I happen to be a big Joe Biden fan, by the way, but I'm just using an example. He's an example of one end of the extreme where you don't have to get in early. And I'm more an example on the other end of the stream, which is I think I have really good ideas and I'm the right person for the job. But I need to work harder to make sure people know who I am.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Young. So many people talk about bipartisanship.
Yeah.
On the other side of the aisle, John Kasich wrote a book about that.
Yeah.
So the general idea of bipartisanship is very appealing, I mean,
Right.
to most Americans. But coming to the specific, coming to the policies, many people would, was stuck with the same ideological view on the policy.
Mhm.
So how do you make sense of this divide, and how to translate the general idea of bipartisanship into the real bipartisanship in policies?
So bipartisanship is a means to an end. So I don't actually think of bipartisanship as the end. I mean, in other words, success is not measured solely by how many bipartisan things you pass. Because you could pass a whole bunch of bipartisan stuff around naming post offices, which I have nothing against naming post offices, but it doesn't really advance the arc of the universe, if you will, to quote Dr. King, right? So what you really have to measure is progress. The way you make enduring progress in this country is through bipartisanship. If you look at all the great things we've done, created Social Security, Medicare, sending someone to the moon, the Americans with Disabilities Act, whatever the case may be, it was all done when there was broad support to get it done, and then continued support so that it endures. And so that's why I think it's important. So in terms of how I think about it, I don't think we should want to live in a country where we agree with each other on everything, right? We should want the kind of debates that occurs between people who are advancing progressive ideas and people who are advancing conservative ideas. That to me is a healthy debate. But I almost think of it like a work day. So imagine getting up and going to work at 8 o'clock and spending 8 to 12 kind of arguing the battle of ideas. Then you have your lunch break, and you come back after lunch at 1, and you spend 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 working together on things you agree with each other on and getting them done. That to me would be a pretty good way to think about how our government should work. Battle of ideas, and then when necessary, here's a very simple example. If I take one of my political ads and put it on television, I have to tell you that it was paid for by John Delaney for president. If I take that same ad and put it on social media, I don't have to say that. So there's a reason the Russians put all their ads on social media. It's not because they thought it was better than television, but they didn't have to disclose. My point is, I always use that as an example, because if you go to the average American people and say, well, how many of you think they ought to have the same disclosure in social media as television? I have yet to meet a human being who doesn't believe that. So why hasn't the government done it? Because we don't do anything. Because instead of the kind of the way I broke it down, 8 to 12 and then 1 to 5 or 6, it's kind of 8 to 6, all like what we don't agree with each other on. So that's kind of how I think about it. There's a lot of things where we can find common ground with each other on. And if we spend some time doing that, we'd not only make progress, but we'd actually show the American people we can do some things. And bipartisanship is the means to that end. It's not the end in and of itself.
Hi.
Hi.
So to me, it seems that to win the nomination and then eventually the presidency, you need to sway like apathetic, disenchanted voters. How do you plan on running a campaign that will excite this group?
You mean to get people who haven't voted to vote again? Yeah. Well, in part, I want them to believe in something better. Right? I think at this point, so I'm just trying to catch you. No, it's okay. At this point, so many people have lost faith in their leaders, and as a result, they've lost faith in their government. And I actually think that that puts them in a position where they've lost a little faith in themselves. And I actually think by running a campaign, it's not only about big ideas, like how to deal with climate and those kind of things, but actually showing people we can get it done, and that our politics can be more honorable, honest, decent, and civil, that I think you can inspire people to say, I actually do want something better. I want something better, not only in terms of how they behave, but also in terms of them working and getting things done for me that matter in my lives and the lives of my kids and or my grandkids or whatever the case may be. So I think you would have to inspire them not only in terms of what we can do, but how we have to do it together. And I think there's a lot of people who really are looking for something better, and they've lost faith in their government. And my own opinion is where we are right now is a punctuation of decades of bad politics, where people basically lost faith.
What do you think Mitch McConnell is so afraid of?
In what way?
In terms
particular?
of not bringing up the vote and then sending it to the to Trump, and then he vetoes it, and then they.
Well, I don't think Mitch
override.
McConnell's doing his job, right? So I assume what he's afraid of is the core base of Trump supporters turning on him and maybe turning on his candidates. But to me, it's not about that. It's about doing the right thing. And the right thing for the Congress, which is independent of the executive branch of the United States of America by fundamental design in our Constitution, is to demonstrate its independence. And if the majority of the members of Congress believe the government should be open, which I believe they do, he should get with Speaker Pelosi, and he should figure out how to open up the government in a way that gets 2/3 of the House and the Senate to vote for it, and so it doesn't matter what the president does. Doesn't mean you ignore the president, right? But on this issue, you just ignore the president.
And it goes back to my question: why?
Well, it's politics. I mean, ultimately, right? The president has a strong group of supporters, but he's got to do his job. That's what I would tell him. If I was his best friend and sitting at the table, I'd say, Mitch, just do your job and it'll all work out. Because all this other stuff you can't control. You can't control what the president's going to say about you in an hour, let alone a month. So just do your job and it'll all work out. Because it always kind of does. If you do the right thing, it all works out. That's what I would tell him. But he probably wouldn't listen to me.
Hi, thank you so much
Sure.
for being here. My question is, you've been around Iowa, New Hampshire.
Yeah.
What is the mood there towards the presidential election, and what sort of things have you heard from voters that have really stood out to you?
So the mood is they're very engaged. I mean, they're engaged by nature in Iowa and New Hampshire because I think they get this kind of almost stewardship role they play in this election. And as a lot of folks in Iowa and New Hampshire says, they'll say, listen, our job isn't to pick the president. Our job is to ask all the right questions. So they're super engaged. And I'm spending most of my time talking to Democrats, although in New Hampshire there's a lot of independents. Half the state's independent, so it's kind of very different in many ways. They're very focused on winning, right? They're really focused on winning at the end of the day. That's what Democrats are. But when you get past that, when you get past politics, what they really care about is, in Iowa in particular, they're very concerned about what they see happening to the state. The state's shrinking. It used to have 6 congressional House members, now it's got 4. A lot of the small towns in Iowa, when you drive around them, you see etched on the buildings the stores that used to be there. Now a lot of them are open. So to some extent, the story of this country you see in Iowa, which is tremendous concentration of economic opportunity. I mean, one of the things that I talk about is that, that I think kind of blows people away, is last year in our country, 80% of the venture capital investments, the smart money that starts all these new companies, 80% of that went to 50 counties in the country. There are 3,100 counties in the United States of America. 80% of it went to 50 counties, so 1.6%. Yet we got 80% of our kids live in a county where the jobs that are being created are not as good as the jobs that used to be there. So when I go to places, and a Maytag plant was there forever and it closed, and everyone in that town knows the day it closed. decades ago. They still remember the day. They want to know, how do you create opportunity for them and their kids and maybe their grandkids in those communities? They're really focused on that. And I get it. Listen, my dad was an electrician, you know. My parents didn't go to college, but I grew up at a time where this opportunity, this notion of equality of opportunity was more broadly shared, and we had institutions in our society to support it. And it's not there right now. It's the structural unfairness I'm getting at. And they want answers to that because they're concerned about where things are going. They're worried a robot's going to take their job, how all this technology, all this incredible power we have in our hands that's changing everything, but they also know there's another side to it. So that's one of the main issues that comes up. Thank you.
Congressman Delaney,
Yes.
thank you so much for being here. It's great to hear from you. So I'm wondering, as the first entrant into the Democratic primary field, who do you see as being your toughest competition and why? And this could include people who haven't entered yet.
So maybe it's the entrepreneur in me, because again, my background is I grew up as a blue-collar kid, and I started these two businesses and took them public, and then I decided to be in public service the rest of my life. And so I have the entrepreneur headset, which is it's really, I just got to focus on what I'm doing. And so while I follow all the stuff about the race dynamics, I don't really think about anyone running or not running as being good or bad, because I'm not smart enough to figure all that out. What I can control is what I talk to people about, how well I listen to them, and whether I actually have solutions that really matter and that the ideas that I care about that people can get excited about. And so my campaign is really about the future, and it's about a set of ideas. And so-and-so running may be good or bad for that. I really actually, because truly I've heard all kinds of scenarios about so-and-so running or so-and-so not running. If you're for me, I'm like, I can't control any of that. So why am I? Because it's like one of the things I've learned in life is you focus on what you can control, right? And that's what I'm trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming
Thank
here.
you for having me.
Columnist, McKinsey, others are referring to something called the middle precariat. People who are just one disaster away from bankruptcy. Medical, tornadoes, both of those have happened in my family. We're one of the 25 top industrialized nations who does not consider healthcare a right and other things a right. What would you do to change that mindset?
So I believe we should have universal health care in this country, and everyone should have health care as a right. I think it's a basic human right. I also think it's smart economics. But you're right, you know, the Federal Reserve last year said 50% of the American people could not afford a surprise $500 expense. So whether it's health care, or maybe it's just their car breaking down, or something happening to their apartment or a house, right, or obviously health care, and it's $500, they don't have the savings or the capacity in their credit card. It's half the population, the wealthiest nation in the world. I mean, 500,000 people every night go homeless. 100 people die every day from opioids. 1 in 5 kids in this country go hungry every day. And we have tens of millions of people who are food insecure. So clearly it's not working. And healthcare is a key part of that. So I favor a universal healthcare system where everyone has a basic government healthcare plan as a right. Think of it like Medicare. But then they have the options of buying supplementals like people do with Medicare. So I favor a government plan for people from when they're born to they're 65, and then when they're over 65, they get Medicare. Maybe over time those merge together. But for now, I think you leave Medicare alone. And then you allow people to buy supplementals like they do in Medicare. So that gives people the options that they like in our country, but they have a basic plan as a right. And I pay for that whole system, because what I just said will cost a bunch of money. And we got to talk about how we're going to pay for this stuff. I'd pay for that whole system by getting rid of the corporate deductibility of healthcare. Because I think having healthcare tied to your job is a bad system. Again, my dad was a union electrician. He had one job for 60 years. Maybe it made sense to tie healthcare to your job back then. But I think my kids, I have 4 daughters, I think my kids may have 10 jobs. I don't want them making a decision about where they work because of their healthcare. If they want to start a business, I don't want them to say, no, I can't do that because of my healthcare. You know, I just think it should be, you should have a basic portable plan. And I think it's smart economic policy.
A quick addendum.
Yeah, sure.
Agree with you, is that also frees up entrepreneurs.
Absolutely.
The healthcare burden isn't on them. A lot of them.
And what I say to people who sometimes push back at me, I'll say, listen, you may not realize this, but we have universal health care in this country right now. It's called an emergency room. If you show up in an emergency room, by law, they have to take care of you. Now, it costs 15 times more than a doctor's visit. and there's no preventative health care. But if that's the kind of universal health care system you want, let's just keep watching our health care costs grow 2 to 3 times inflation and act like a doomsday machine gobbling up all federal expenditures, because that's what it's going to do.
So you were talking a few minutes ago about how you go to Iowa, and the prevailing view is that, and this is kind of true in rural America in general, is that people are concerned about, you know, their shrinking economies, their shrinking lifestyle, their shrinking opportunities, and I think your statistic about all the venture money going into the 50 counties makes a lot of sense. I don't know if there's a solution to that problem. I think a lot of it is just technology is advancing and folks aren't keeping up with it. But what you talked about the issue, but what's the solution, if there is a solution to this?
So I think there is a solution, which doesn't mean it's going to solve the problem everywhere. So this is the 4 things I would do. The first thing I did, and it actually did become law, is something called the Distressed Opportunities Investment Act. And it became law as part of this tax reform bill. It was my bill. I didn't vote for the tax reform bill. It got gobbled up in my bill, but I was supportive of that. And it says if you're an investor and you have an appreciated investment and you sell it, you can defer your capital gains for 10 years if you invest the proceeds in an economic opportunity zone. And every governor in the country is drawing these opportunity zones right now. So that's the first thing. You create an incentive for private capital to go in these places. The second thing is you go to the government contractors. You know, the U.S. government is the largest buyer of goods and services in the world. I would say, in my administration, 25% of government contracts are going to be written to firms that have 50% of their employees in these opportunity zones. Second thing I do. Third thing I do, I would do a national infrastructure plan because we desperately need infrastructure. But I would have a disproportionate allocation of those dollars to these opportunity zones. And then the fourth thing I would do is I'd like to double the earned income tax credit in this country, which is, you may know, is a tax credit that puts money in the pockets of working people. But at a minimum, I'd like to double it in these opportunity zones. So if you did that to make it easier for companies to hire workers and have the workers get a decent wage, if you had a disproportionate infrastructure investment, if you had an incentive for private capital, and then you created a reason for companies to locate there because they get a preference on a government contract, you create a whole bunch of incentives so that when I'm done being president, I don't think 80% will go to 50 counties. I'm hoping 80% goes to 1,500 counties. Doesn't mean it's going to be evenly distributed, right? But and you may not be able to turn around every county in Iowa. There's 99 of them, and some of them are doing really well, like Polk County, where Des Moines is. But maybe you turn around half of them, and that still fundamentally changes things because people can stay close, blah blah blah. So that's what I would do specifically. Have a real agenda.
Does this? I hear this a lot. Does this take into consideration changing demographics? When you look around this room, and most of the people in this room have no interest. I'm just going to make an assumption for all of you. Most of the people in this room have no interest in living in rural areas any longer, and most of the people in this room probably don't even want to live in the suburbs. I have kids that are in their 20s. Yep. They have no interest in the suburbs. They want to raise their families in cities. They want to live in Brooklyn. They want to live in Wicker Park. Mm-hmm. You know, I think there's. I love those ideas, but yep. I don't know if it even ties into demographic reality.
No, I think it does. I mean, look, first of all, things change, and we all know. Everything changes. And, you know, what the trends are now, those trends can be different in not too long. If you look at even the heartland of this country, if you look what's happened in the last 20 years, you haven't seen every kind of smaller city relative to Chicago or New York turn around, but you've seen a lot of them. Des Moines, for example, is doing really well. A bunch of people, and one in particular who was key to my campaigns in Congress, was working now in my presidential campaign, and he moved from the Washington area to Des Moines to work on my campaign. He says it's the best thing that ever happened to him. He loves it. Milwaukee, doing great. No, seriously. There's a bunch of places that are actually, there's a bunch of places that are turning around. And so, you know, again, I don't think we can have a central planning approach, like, you know, a Soviet central planning saying we're going to blah, 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 blah. You can't do that. But you create some incentives. Because, you know, the average home price in San Francisco is $1.05 million. So they got a whole separate set of problems. affordable housing. People who don't earn earn a program in Silicon Valley, they got to drive 3 hours to get to work. A lot of these people are actually looking for a better lifestyle. You create some engines of economic opportunity in these communities. Suddenly arts programs get set up, restaurants come in. It creates a bit of a better vibe even for young people.
So in regards to U.S. foreign policy, what role do you think America should play in the world? Given examples of the Crimea incident in 2014 or something like the South China Sea, do you think America should be more engaged in addressing these threats, or do you think we should kind of draw back a little bit?
I generally favor a policy of U.S. engagement. I generally think the post-World War II model to U.S. foreign policy has been correct. That doesn't mean everything we've done has been correct. I mean, the Iraq War was a terrible, terrible decision, et cetera. But the notion of the U.S. engaging internationally through diplomatic channels, through economic channels, and then through the role that our military plays, and trying to engage for peace and security and prosperity around the world, I'm all in on that model. Doesn't mean we solve every problem. But I do think for all the big problems facing the world, whether it be migration, which is one of the huge problems facing the next decades, driven by climate change, which is another problem, disruption through automation, 800 million people around the world are likely to have their job displaced or changed in the next 20 years. These are all going to create massive moments of instability. I want the United States as at the head of the table helping to solve these problems with our unique portfolio of allies, and just constantly committed to try to build a world that's more just and prosperous for not only our citizens, but the world. I never think, at this moment in time, I think what happens around the world is more important in the United States than it's ever been. So I favor a model of engagement, which doesn't mean militarily engagement, but it means, I almost think about it like this. We shouldn't have a meeting around the world without our head economic policy person and our head diplomat together, right? Always meeting. And so like the islands that China is building in the South China Sea, I believe are illegal islands, right? And we should be standing up for that and taking the battle to China. I mean, listen, I think China has in many ways acted like pirates in a lot of circumstances. They steal intellectual property. We shouldn't allow U.S. companies who have intellectual property that was the byproduct of U.S. government research dollars. We shouldn't allow those companies to put them in joint ventures with Chinese companies, right, because they're taking the property. I don't want to go to war with China, but I want to hold them accountable. And the South China Sea is a way, I mean, I think we have to be clear that those islands are illegal. That doesn't mean we engage in a military action, but you continue to build pressure with our allies. That's how I think about it.
Time for two more, so I'll go here and then.
Hi. So I know that you mentioned the carbon bill as a possible way to address climate change on a domestic level, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about your vision for the United States in terms of its involvement in climate policy on an international level.
So it's kind of similar to what I just talked about. So like within 5 minutes of being president, I would get us back in Paris. Not that Paris in and of itself is going to solve the problem, but like we can't not be part of something that 180 countries agreed to and have any credibility on this issue. So, you know, I think we've got to lead, right? And if we're not leading here, we have no basis of going around the world and saying, you need to lead. So we obviously don't control energy policy in sovereign countries around the world. But we certainly are not going to have the ability to try to encourage energy policy in sovereign countries around the world unless we actually get our energy policy right here. So I want to be engaged in those conversations, but I also want to be able to brag about what we're doing. That's how I think about that.
You've spoken about focusing on pre-existing bipartisan legislation in your
first
100 days.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The walk before you run phase.
So I'm curious, what is the top domestic policy area that you would champion as your first priority after those 100 days of bipartisan legislation is up?
Well, hopefully I get it all done the first. No, I'm only kidding. So look, I think, you know, I think climate is a big issue. I think fixing the U.S. healthcare system. It probably won't be fixed in 100 days. So let's leave it at that. Even though there's a good bipartisan bill that Senators Murray and Alexander have that I would want to champion. But I think the system we talked about, which is to move to this universal health care system, delinking it from work, I think is incredibly important. And it's not only important for people, it's important for the fiscal health of the country. Because I'd also say to the country, we are on an unsustainable fiscal trajectory. And I think we need more revenues to solve that problem, but we also have to fix health care. Because you cannot allow healthcare costs to grow at the rate they're doing, and it'll crowd out everything. So I think healthcare policy, you know, and climate policy and the fiscal trajectory, they're the big long-term drivers that you have to get right. You know, I'd like to do I'd like to have a national artificial intelligence strategy developed in the first 100 days. I'd call for that. Because we need, as a government, a private sector, and a nonprofit sector, to have an agreement on 4 areas, which is how are we going to handle work disruption because of technology, how are we going to handle national security issues because of technology, how are we going to handle digital privacy because of technology, and how are we going to handle programming bias, where machines will be making a lot of the decisions that human makes now, and I worry that existing biases that we're trying to overcome in our society get programmed into those exact machines. So I think I'd announce that policy and put together the, quote, commission to work on it, and then, but unfolding it would be, to me, that's a big issue. That was a good last question.
Well, thank you, Congressman,
Thank you,
so much.
Professor.
We really appreciate it.
What a smart group of people you have here. Not a surprise.